It was the third evening of my solo hike along a southern stretch of the Appalachian Trail, deep in the backwoods of West Virginia, when I encountered someone I still think about to this day. The forest had already begun to settle into that quiet lull that comes just before twilight, when the light grows thin and silvery through the treetops, and shadows start to bleed together at the edges of the trail. I had just descended from a wooded ridge where the air had taken on a mild chill, and the path had narrowed into a corridor of second-growth trees and thick brush that allowed little visibility beyond a few paces in either direction. It was at that moment, rounding a slow curve in the trail, that I noticed a figure approaching from the opposite direction. Someone walking alone, just as I was, but not in any way that resembled a fellow hiker. His appearance struck me immediately as out of place, not for any single reason I could put into words at first, but due to a subtle accumulation of things that didn't quite add up. He was dressed in faded blue jeans and worn, low-cut sneakers that looked better suited for concrete than soil. And he wore a light gray zip-up hoodie with the sleeves pushed carelessly to his elbows, despite the cooling temperature. There was no visible backpack on him, not even a day pack or water bottle, and certainly no headlamp or flashlight, which struck me as odd given that nightfall was rapidly approaching. And this portion of the trail could grow treacherously dark in a matter of minutes. The only item he carried was a single, limp plastic grocery bag, like the kind you'd get at a convenience store, dangling from his right hand with a lightness that suggested it held almost nothing of substance inside, perhaps a single object or two, though its contents were shapeless and silent as it swung with each step he took. As we neared each other, I moved a little off to the side, as is customary when two people pass on a narrow trail. He didn't speak, didn't offer a nod or any gesture of acknowledgement, and though our eyes met for the briefest moment as he passed, there was something oddly distant in his expression, as though he was looking through me rather than at me. His face was lean, almost hollow in the cheeks, with a slightly sunken quality around the eyes that gave him a tired, vaguely uninterested appearance. Not dazed or aggressive, not confused or frantic, but strangely indifferent to his surroundings, as if he were walking through places he neither respected nor feared. It wasn't a look that asked for help, nor did it carry the usual edge of defensiveness I had come to expect from encountering strangers in isolated places. Instead, it was the look of someone who seemed completely detached from the moment, as though he had no real investment in where he was or who might be watching. I turned to glance over my shoulder once as he passed, half expecting him to stop or look back. But he simply continued down the trail at the same even pace, disappearing into the dim, wooded path behind me, without a word, without a light, and without so much as the sound of snapping twigs or shifting brush. I told myself at the time that perhaps he lived somewhere nearby, some reclusive local maybe, or a transient person cutting through the forest on foot. But deep down, I felt something I couldn't quite name settle into my gut. There had been nothing overtly threatening in his presence, yet I couldn't shake the sense that he didn't belong there in any way that made logical sense. I reached my intended campsite about 40 minutes later. A small, relatively flat clearing tucked beside a shallow stream that trickled steadily beneath a canopy of overhanging limbs. The air had grown cooler by then, and the fading light had taken on a bluish cast, prompting me to set up my tent quickly and prepare for the night before darkness fell completely. I went through the usual rituals that had become second nature to me over the years. Filtering water, boiling a simple meal, recording a few notes in my trail journal by the dim glow of my headlamp. And I remember thinking how perfectly ordinary everything still felt. despite the lingering unease I couldn't quite shake. I crawled into my tent around 9:30 that night, zipping the flap almost completely shut, but leaving it slightly open at the base. Just a small gap, a habit I'd picked up over time to allow a bit of airflow on calm nights like this one. Sometime deep in the night, I awoke with the acute and inexplicable awareness that something in the environment had shifted, though I couldn't immediately identify what it was that had disturbed me. There had been no loud noise, no sudden jolt, just a quiet, creeping stillness that seemed too complete, too deliberate, like the natural sounds of the forest had been smothered under an invisible blanket. The usual nocturnal symphony, crickets, rustling branches, the distant babble of the stream, had all gone silent, leaving behind a kind of pressing emptiness that felt as though it had weight. I lay completely still, my breath shallow and quiet, instinctively listening for something I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. Then, from just outside the thin wall of nylon that separated me from the woods, I heard them. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving in a wide circle around my tent. They were not hurried or panicked, not trying to sneak, but rather steady and unbroken. Each step sounding intentional, as though whoever was out there was pacing slowly with complete awareness of the space they were navigating. The first full circle was followed by another, then another, each pass identical in rhythm and distance, like someone carefully measuring a perimeter, taking their time with each loop. The weight of the steps, the cadence, and the proximity left no doubt in my mind that this was a human presence, not a curious animal or distant deer wandering through the clearing. Whoever it was, they were close. Close enough that I could sense their outline moving just feet away in the darkness, even though I dared not move or sit up to confirm it. On what I believe was the fourth slow pass around my tent, the footsteps came to a stop, abruptly and without any rustling, just beside the left wall of the tent. So close that I could sense the figure standing not more than a foot from my head, separated from me only by a thin layer of nylon. I remember lying perfectly still, breathing as quietly as I could manage, every part of me waiting for the next sound, the next sign, though part of me already understood how truly helpless I was in that moment. I didn't reach for my flashlight, didn't call out, didn't even shift my position, because the kind of fear I felt wasn't loud or frantic. It was measured, exact, and fully aware of how exposed I had suddenly become. Then I heard it. The unmistakable sound of the zipper on my tent being drawn down in one steady pull. It wasn't fast, and it wasn't done in panic or confusion. It was quiet, careful, almost polite, as though whoever was out there had noticed the small gap I'd left open at the bottom and decided, for reasons I'll never understand, to close it for me. The motion didn't sound like someone preparing to come inside, nor like someone rummaging or fumbling by accident. It sounded like the last step in a thought-out decision, a final action before leaving. And then, nothing. There were no footsteps walking away, no sound of brush being pushed aside, no voice, just that heavy, dragging stillness all around me. Whether the person stayed nearby or simply faded back into the woods, I couldn't say. I stayed awake until the sky began to pale. When the first hints of daylight finally began to color the fabric of the tent in dull gray, I eased the zipper open with as little noise as I could manage and stepped outside. The clearing looked exactly as it had the evening before. Untouched, undisturbed, just another quiet piece of forest. The dirt was soft, but didn't show any clear footprints. The branches weren't bent. The perimeter of the site, which I walked twice, gave me nothing to go on. But the feeling that someone had stood right there in the dark, watching me, circling me, and then choosing to close me in, that stayed. And it still does. I broke camp faster than usual, skipping breakfast and moving with a kind of mechanical focus, not because I was in a rush, but because I didn't want to linger. I passed a couple of hikers later that morning going northbound. And while I nodded as I passed, I didn't say a word about what had happened. I didn't write about it in the shelter logbooks. I didn't mention it to the ranger station when I eventually checked out of that section of trail. And when I got back home, I found that I didn't really talk about it with anyone close to me either. Not because I didn't remember it clearly, but because I couldn't think of a way to explain it that didn't sound like a story that had been exaggerated in the retelling. But it wasn't. I know what I saw. I know what I heard. A man in ordinary clothes, walking a trail at twilight with no gear, no flashlight, and no destination. I know I lay awake while footsteps circled me in the dark. I know someone stood at the side of my tent and zipped it shut from the outside without a word. And I know that even though nothing was taken and no direct harm came to me, that presence, whoever it was not wandering by accident. I still go backpacking. I still camp in remote places. But after that night, I started locking things down a little tighter. I zip my tent all the way now, every time. I don't assume that quiet means I'm alone. And even when the woods feel calm, even when everything seems just as it should be, I don't fall asleep as easily as I used to. Something about that night stayed with me, not as a nightmare, not even as a trauma, really, but as a quiet, permanent shift in how I understand what solitude really means. It was during the warmer stretch of the summer in 2022 when I made the decision to undertake a solo camping trip into a remote section of Mount Hood National Forest. Not out of impulsiveness or in pursuit of some novelty, but simply because I had come to rely on these excursions as a way of restoring a sense of clarity I could never seem to find in the clutter of day-to-day life. The idea of being unreachable, of stepping away from the artificial urgency of notifications, schedules, and voices that never stopped talking, had always appealed to me more than I cared to admit aloud. I had spent years becoming proficient at this kind of isolation, learning how to read weather shifts in the treetops, how to navigate without digital prompts, and how to find comfort in the quiet language of the forest. By the second day of my route, I had already drifted well beyond the outer boundaries of where most hikers typically go, deliberately avoiding maintained trails and choosing instead to follow a topographic map that marked dry creek beds, elevation drops, and contours of land that didn't exist on public maps. The trees in that part of the forest were older, their trunks broad and mottled with thick green moss that clung to bark like weathered velvet. And as I moved further into the denser patches, the light filtering through the canopy dimmed into a greenish hue that gave the entire area a dreamlike quality. As if I had stepped into a forgotten pocket of wilderness that had not been disturbed in decades. It was in the late afternoon, just as the sun began to drift lower in the sky and cast longer, slanted shadows across the forest floor, when I came across something that made me stop walking entirely. At first, I couldn't quite make out what I was seeing through the trees. It was only a vague shape, something pale and angular that didn't match the organic shape surrounding it. As I drew closer, stepping carefully through the undergrowth and listening to the soft hush of my boots pressing down layers of pine needles and damp soil, it became clear that I had stumbled upon a structure of some kind. Though structure seemed too generous a word for what it actually was. Someone had constructed a makeshift shelter using a blue-gray tarp that had clearly seen better days. The material was frayed along the edges, sun-faded, and held taut between 4 trees with a combination of mismatched ropes and strips of torn fabric. Beneath the shelter lay a number of objects that, taken together, suggested not only recent human presence, but the kind of presence that had intended to linger. There was a compact folding camp stove positioned neatly on a bed of flattened leaves, and beside it, a propane canister lying on its side, with just enough dust on it to imply that it had not been used in at least several days, but not long enough to have been abandoned for good. Scattered nearby were several food cans, corn, beans, a few off-brand stew labels, and 2 cans of fruit that had rust forming in delicate rings around the rims. The kind of slow degradation that indicated exposure to moisture, not neglect. What truly unsettled me, however, was what I found just beyond the edge of the tarp, where someone, or something, had attempted to conceal a pile of clothing beneath a loose assembly of branches and moss-covered debris, as if trying to disguise it without taking the time to bury it properly. The clothing, once I leaned down to inspect it more closely, was in poor condition. Not simply weather-worn or discarded, but deliberately torn and soiled in ways that suggested violence, or at the very least, a desperate exit. There was a plaid flannel shirt with one sleeve entirely missing, as if it had been ripped away at the shoulder seam, and a pair of jeans that had been split from thigh to knee with a cut that was too clean to have been caused by thorns or natural wear. A single boot sat at the edge of the pile, its laces missing and its sole sliced open in a narrow, precise line, as though someone had taken a knife to it in an attempt to search for something hidden inside, or perhaps to render it useless. One sock lay bunched beside the boot, stained a dark reddish brown at the heel, too discolored to be mud and far too dry to be fresh blood, but unmistakably unsettling. There were no signs of a recent fire, no fresh footprints in the dirt, and no smell of decay or rot that would have suggested a body or animal remains nearby. Yet I could not shake the sensation that I had walked into a place that had been left in a hurry, not abandoned so much as interrupted. The meticulousness of the food, the intact stove, and the orderly placement of gear all suggested intention and presence. But the shredded clothing and attempts to obscure it painted a completely different story. It felt like the remnants of a narrative that had been forcibly cut off, like finding the last page of a book smeared and burned before the final sentence could be read. I did not touch anything. I made a slow, deliberate circle around the perimeter of the shelter, and then backed away without taking my eyes off the trees, not out of fear of being attacked, but because something in the air had shifted, subtle at first, but unmistakable. The forest no longer felt passive and inviting. It felt aware, alert. The stillness had taken on a density that pressed against my chest, as though the woods themselves were holding their breath. I moved back along the route I had come, retracing my own boot prints until I reached a small stream I had crossed earlier that afternoon. And there, within the sound of trickling water, I set up my tent on a flat, dry patch of ground that felt far enough from the shelter to grant me distance, even if not peace. As the light faded and the temperature dropped, I prepared a small meal and forced myself to go through my usual nighttime routine, clearing the area of food, securing the tent, writing in my waterproof journal, though I omitted any mention of what I had found. I think, in retrospect, I didn't write it down because doing so would have made it more real. I told myself I was being cautious, not frightened. But there was a tightness in my chest that never fully released as the last of the daylight gave way to darkness. At some indistinct hour in the middle of the night, I stirred from sleep with the disquieting awareness that something about the environment outside my tent had changed. Not because I heard a noise, but because all the small, familiar sounds I had grown accustomed to over countless nights in the wilderness had suddenly vanished. The distant rustle of wind moving through pine needles, the occasional snap of settling branches, even the quiet gurgle of the nearby stream. All of it had gone silent at once, as though the entire forest were holding its breath. That silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt expectant, like the pause between a question and an answer you aren't prepared to give. I stayed still, trying to listen without moving, straining to separate imagined unease from real stimuli. That's when I heard them. Footsteps, slow and unnervingly intentional, moving through the brush with the kind of awareness that suggested someone was deliberately placing their feet to avoid noise, not simply passing through. The sound would come in pairs or singles, then stop for long, unnatural pauses, as though whoever it was had to constantly reassess their path or their proximity. It wasn't random movement. It felt deliberate, like circling. I lay in my sleeping bag, frozen, my body rigid beneath the thin fabric walls of my tent. And even though I was technically protected from the outside world, the material suddenly felt useless, as though it were nothing more than a suggestion of shelter. I didn't reach for my flashlight. I didn't unzip the tent flap. Every instinct told me to stay still and quiet, and so I did, for what felt like hours. At one point, the footsteps stopped entirely, and I started to believe that maybe the sounds had been some trick of my imagination, that my mind was spiraling under the pressure of the unknown. But then I heard it, a distinct, purposeful snap. One single branch, breaking somewhere beyond the tent, loud enough to be deliberate, sharp enough to feel like it had been meant for me to hear. Eventually, just as the first suggestions of dawn began to appear, no more than a faint silvering of the sky beyond the treetops, the sounds stopped completely. I waited until there was enough daylight to make out the contours of the forest before unzipping the tent. My movements slow and methodical, not out of fear of disturbing anything, but out of a desire to not see what I feared might be there. The forest, in the soft light of morning, looked unchanged. Mist still hung low between the trees, the stream murmured steadily nearby, and birds had begun their cautious calls from higher branches. But something was wrong. Wrong in a way that didn't involve noise or movement, but detail. There on the ground, not more than 2 or 3 feet from the entrance of my tent, lay 3 sticks, each one broken recently and arranged in a precise triangle, their splintered ends turned outward, their lengths matching closely enough that the placement felt too intentional to ignore. I had cleared the area the night before. I would have noticed anything that specific. Someone had come close to where I slept and had left it there, quietly, deliberately, in the hours when I was most vulnerable and unaware. I didn't try to rationalize it. I didn't assume it was a prank. And I didn't entertain the idea that maybe I'd missed it the night before. I knew, with a certainty that didn't require explanation, that someone had been there, not just watching, but standing close enough to reach the tent, to leave a sign, to turn my understanding of the night into something quietly terrifying. I didn't eat. I I didn't boil water for coffee or repack my gear with care. I stuffed everything I owned into my pack, laced up my boots with numb fingers, and pulled out my emergency map so I could plot the fastest possible route back to the nearest forest access road, even if it meant slogging across steep grades or skipping landmarks I had originally intended to visit. I didn't stop for breaks. I didn't look back. I never contacted park rangers. I didn't mark the location. And I certainly didn't file any kind of report. There was no damage, no theft, no visible crime. Just a shelter in the middle of nowhere, some scattered torn clothing, and footsteps in the dark that culminated in a triangle of sticks arranged with a kind of quiet purpose I still can't make sense of. I've continued to hike and camp in the years since. I haven't sworn off the wilderness, but I've never returned to that section of Mount Hood, and I never will. The memory of that night stays with me, not because anything dramatic happened, but because nothing did. No confrontation, no threat, just a presence and a gesture that suggested I had come too close to something I was not meant to see. And in the woods, sometimes that's the clearest warning you'll ever get. In the late autumn of 2021, as the days grew shorter and the first whispers of snow began to drift through the higher altitudes of Colorado, I set out on a backcountry hiking trip with two close friends. Danielle, who had always possessed an uncanny calm even in unfamiliar terrain, and Marcus, who had a quiet way of taking charge when it counted, relying on his methodical preparation and obsession with old, out-of-print topographic maps that showed forgotten routes and seasonal springs that hadn't appeared on standard trails for decades. We had all grown accustomed to the usual circuits over the years, places where other hikers might pass within a day. But for this particular trip, we chose a more reclusive stretch in the San Juan Mountains, one that promised silence, solitude, and complete distance from civilization. By the second day, after leaving the last thread of trail behind, we navigated by compass and terrain contour alone, eventually arriving at a sloping, pine-fringed clearing that sat beside a spring trickling from a notch in the stone ridge above us. Water so cold and clear it felt untouched by time. The clearing was small, just large enough to accommodate our tents without pressing too closely to the dense perimeter of trees. And the ground was soft with old needles and moss. We pitched our camp as the last orange light filtered through the treetops, cooked dinner over a low, careful fire, and, after a few hours of idle conversation muffled by the sound of wind moving steadily through the canopy, we retreated to our tents to escape the chill that settled quickly after sunset. At some point well after midnight, I found myself awake without knowing exactly what had disturbed me. And I lay motionless inside my sleeping bag, listening not for anything in particular, but with the sharpened attention that follows sudden waking. That was when I began to notice it. At first, so faint it barely registered as sound at all. A distant blend of laughter and what I thought might be music, although it didn't resemble anything I could immediately recognize. It wasn't loud, and it didn't follow a clear melody like something from a nearby camp or radio transmission. Instead, it drifted uneasily through the trees in odd bursts, as though it came from no fixed direction and obeyed no logical source. For several minutes, I remained still, trying to isolate the sounds from the rustle of trees or the hum of wind, until eventually I heard Danielle stir quietly in the sleeping bag beside mine. And a moment later, Marcus shifted in his own tent. Though we did not speak, we each knew the others were awake and listening, each of us processing the same strange auditory presence that now filled the air in thin, uneven threads. The laughter, if that's what it truly was, didn't sound entirely natural. It rose and fell like something rehearsed, and there were moments when I could almost convince myself that it was being repeated, looped in some imperfect pattern. Beneath it, the music continued, slow and meandering, as if it had been recorded on a damaged medium where time warbled and bent around the notes. None of us reached for a flashlight or unzipped the tent right away, possibly because we were still trying to rationalize it as something distant, explainable. Maybe a far-off hunter camp or an unusual echo carried on the wind. But when Marcus finally did unzip the flap and stepped outside, letting a sharp rush of cold air pour into the tent, the sounds ceased in an instant, not fading gradually, as one might expect if the source were natural and distant, but disappearing completely, as though someone had closed a door or severed a connection. The silence that followed was somehow deeper than the silence that had preceded the sounds, and I recall feeling, for the first time, except in years of outdoor experience, that the forest itself had become aware of us in a way that made my skin crawl beneath the layers of synthetic fabric and down. We sat up for a while longer, huddled in our jackets near the remnants of the fire, speaking very little and mostly just listening for any recurrence of what we'd heard. But the woods offered nothing more. No wind, no birds, not even the gentle trickle of the spring, which had become so embedded in the background of our presence that its absence now felt jarring. The next morning, under a sky that had turned brittle with high clouds and dry air, we decided to search the forest in the general direction we thought the sounds might have originated. It was a vague guess at best, since whatever we'd heard had not followed any predictable path. But curiosity, and perhaps a quiet unease, pushed us forward, up a shallow rise where the trees thinned slightly and sunlight fell across the slope in narrow gold strips. There, partially hidden by a curve in the terrain and overgrown with dry brush, we found what appeared to be the remnants of an old fire ring. Rough stone set into the soil in a careful circle, blackened from long extinguished flames and coated with the greenish fuzz of moss that only accumulates after years of abandonment. The center of the ring held only the most fragile remains of charred wood, which crumbled to dust at the slightest touch, and no modern signs of use. No footprints, no wrappers, no signs that anyone had recently disturbed the ground. What struck me most, and what I did not say out loud at the time, was the way the fire ring had been positioned. Though it appeared random at first, I realized that from where it sat, if you crouched beside it and looked through the narrow notch between two slanted pine trunks, you could see directly into our clearing, the very spot where our tents had been set the night before. The view was narrow and specific, like a peephole cut through the trees, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been chosen for that exact purpose, not for warmth or shelter, but for watching without being seen. That second night, though we were all visibly tired, we skipped the fire and went to bed without any real discussion, each of us pretending not to notice the tension that hung between us like fog that had never lifted. I lay awake again, muscles taut beneath my sleeping bag, staring at the tent ceiling while trying to keep my thoughts rational and grounded in things I could explain. But when the sounds began again, more distinctly this time, I knew that we had crossed into territory that no practical reasoning could fully navigate. The music returned, louder now, with the strange limping cadence of a piano being played by someone either inexperienced or distracted. And layered over it came voices that drifted between dialogue and chant, repeating certain phrases with a kind of mechanical insistence that made my scalp prickle. The laughter was still there, though it had lost any sense of joy, and instead resembled something more ritualistic, more performative. As if someone were trying to mimic what laughter was supposed to sound like, rather than feeling it themselves. I reached for my phone, intending to record what I could and prove to myself that it wasn't some shared dream or trick of the mind, only to find the screen unresponsive and black, despite having had a full battery earlier that evening. Danielle said her power bank had turned off without warning, and Marcus, who had always worn a solar-charged field watch, said that it had inexplicably reset itself to midnight and refused to show anything else. Eventually, when Marcus unzipped the tent and stepped out into the cold, we all instinctively held still, as if any sudden movement might provoke something we couldn't fully understand. And just like before, the moment that flap opened and the outside air hit our skin, the sounds stopped, abruptly and completely. Not faded or drowned out, just gone. What remained wasn't the kind of quiet you expect deep in the wilderness, where the wind whispers through the trees and the occasional owl stirs in the dark. It was hollow, absolute. No creaking limbs, no rustling leaves, not even the soft burble of the spring just yards away. It was the kind of silence that makes your heart beat louder in your ears, the kind that feels like it's watching you back. By morning, none of us wanted to talk about it, at least not out loud. We broke camp before the sun cleared the ridge, moving with that unspoken coordination that happens only when people are equally spooked. There was no coffee, no joking around, no usual trailhead rituals, just gear getting zipped, boots getting tightened, and packs thrown over shoulders with a kind of grim focus. We took the long way out, avoiding the direction where we'd found the fire ring the day before. Nobody said why. Only once we reached the dirt road near the trailhead, still miles from the nearest paved route, did Marcus finally speak. He said he kept thinking about how that fire ring had been positioned, how it had that narrow sightline directly into our clearing, like someone had once sat there and just watched. He didn't say it dramatically. There was no edge to it. It was flat, just a fact that had settled into his bones. Danielle didn't answer. Neither did I. Honestly, there didn't seem to be a good way to respond without inviting more questions none of us really wanted to ask. At the ranger station, we kept things light. We didn't report anything, didn't mention the sounds, didn't mention the fire ring, just asked if anyone else had logged into that part of the wilderness recently, as if we were just curious about traffic. The ranger, a guy in his 60s with weathered skin and that tired but courteous tone you hear from people who've spent years listening to stories they'd rather not dig into, said we were the only ones registered for that section that weekend. He added, almost like an afterthought, that most people avoided that area late in the season. Something about bad footing, early snow, and the trail being more trouble than it's worth. We nodded and left it at that. In the time since, I've gone back into the woods plenty of times, but never alone, never that deep. I still enjoy the quiet, but now I stay within reach of trail markers, somewhere I can hear the distant murmur of other campers or see the glow of a headlamp through the trees. I don't think any of us have talked about that trip since, at least not in a way that puts it into words. It's one of those things that lives in the background, like a strange shape in your peripheral vision that vanishes the moment you look directly at it. And every so often, late at night, when the world is quiet and the power's out, or my phone dies unexpectedly, I catch myself listening harder than I should. I don't always hear anything, but when I do, just barely, just on the edge, it sounds a little like laughter, and something that might have once been music. It was in the final days of August that we decided to step away from our routines and spend a few nights immersed in a part of the Maine backwoods that was almost entirely removed from the established trail systems. A stretch of forest land I had discovered through a combination of outdated park documents and offline satellite maps that showed nothing but unbroken woodland. No trailheads, no campsites, no ranger cabins or access roads. Just a dense swath of unmaintained wilderness stretching for miles in every direction. The plan had been simple in its intention, but difficult in execution. To find silence, real silence, the kind that settles over you in places untouched by the sounds of engines, the glow of distant campfires, or the rustle of strangers' footsteps through dead leaves. By the time we'd reached the clearing I had marked earlier on my printed map, the sun had already begun to tilt westward, filtered in soft golden slants through the tall moss-covered trunks of pine and spruce that crowded the higher ridges. The hike had taken longer than expected, not because of the distance itself, but because every step required slow navigation through thick underbrush, over loose stones slick with old water, and across sections of the forest floor where roots braided themselves above the ground in thick, knotted webs that caught your boots and made you feel like the land itself was resisting your passage. We had paused often to check our compass, to rest our shoulders from the weight of our packs, and to listen, not for danger, but for the absence of human presence, which in a place like that was its own kind of reassurance. The site itself was perched on a gentle rise, overlooking a natural basin below. A wide depression in the forest floor that appeared to have once been carved by water or glacial movement, now ringed with uneven stone and soft tufts of moss-covered earth that dipped into a quiet, sheltered hollow. From where we set up our tent, just a few feet from the tree line, we had a clear vantage point down into that shallow clearing. And I distinctly remember standing there as the last light faded, scanning the floor of that basin and noting how completely untouched it appeared. No animal tracks, no trampled grass, no remnants of human passage, only the irregular geometry of fallen logs and the silver-gray trunks of distant birches leaning slightly in the breeze. That night passed without incident. The fire crackled softly beside us as we sat in foldable camp chairs, letting the night settle in stages, first with the dimming of light above the trees, then with the emergence of stars through the broken canopy, and finally with the arrival of that heavy, insulating silence that only appears once even the smallest creatures have tucked themselves away. There was a kind of comfort in that quiet, in the way it pressed close around us and made even the smallest sound, like the shifting of our jackets or the pop of a coal, feel amplified. I remember looking out into the basin one last time, before retreating into the tent, and seeing nothing but soft darkness pooled in the clearing below, its boundaries barely outlined by the silhouettes of rocks and trees. The morning came late and gray, with low cloud cover hanging just above the trees and the air thick with moisture. The kind that clings to your skin even before the day properly warms. After a simple breakfast and some aimless conversation, I wandered back toward the edge of the ridge to take in the view again, expecting to see the same quiet clearing, unchanged, undisturbed. What I saw instead made me pause without fully understanding why at first, until my eyes adjusted and locked onto a shape that had not been there the day before. Where the clearing had previously been nothing more than open ground and scattered brush, there now stood a tent, vivid red in color, dome-shaped, and almost shockingly bright against the muted greens and browns of the surrounding forest. Its presence was immediate and undeniable, as though it had always been there, except I knew with absolute certainty that it hadn't. I had stared down into that basin repeatedly the day before, from multiple angles and in full daylight, and there had been no structure of any kind. The tent hadn't arrived gradually, and no signs had indicated anyone had passed through during the night. There had been no breaking of branches, no shifting of shadows, no sound of zippers or fabric flapping in wind. Just silence. And yet, now it stood in plain view. The fabric of the tent appeared clean and taut, without the sagging that comes from dampness or repeated use. It looked recently pitched, with the lines staked down in straight angles and the entry flap hanging halfway open in a way that felt strangely deliberate. There was no sign of movement, no figures nearby, and no scattered equipment or footprints in the surrounding brush. Nothing to suggest that anyone had actually arrived, or had even been near the place. As we made our way down the slope, which was gentle but thickly layered in undergrowth and uneven ground, I remember feeling a peculiar sensation begin to take hold. Not dread exactly, not yet, but a quiet stiffness in the chest, as though the air itself had changed pressure. The deeper we stepped into that clearing, the more the surrounding forest seemed to draw away, not in volume, but in presence, as if everything natural, everything familiar, had taken a subtle step back, leaving us suspended in something that looked like reality, but didn't quite feel like it anymore. We approached the tent slowly, without speaking, both of us now acutely aware of how out of place it looked, not only in terms of color or design, but in the way it simply did not belong to the rhythm or age of the land around it. The closer we got, the more unnatural it felt. Not because it looked threatening, but because there was an absence of all the small, human details that would have made it feel lived in. No extra gear leaning against it, no boot prints pressed into the soft soil, no trail of disturbed earth leading to or from its entrance. It simply existed, whole and complete, like something that had been placed rather than carried. When I finally leaned in and pulled the zipper the rest of the way down, the interior of the tent was revealed in a way that somehow managed to feel both entirely ordinary and deeply unsettling. The space inside was stark, almost surgically clean, with nothing but a single sleeping bag lying unrolled across the center of the floor. Perfectly aligned, its synthetic shell smooth and unwrinkled, as though it had never once been laid in or even handled since being placed there. There were no signs of warmth, no lingering trace of someone having left recently. No food wrappers, no lantern, no spare clothes or gear piled near the corners the way real campers inevitably leave them, whether out of habit or fatigue. Everything felt deliberate in its absence. Just beneath the edge of the zippered flap, partially tucked under the lip of the tent wall where it might have easily gone unnoticed, lay a small square of white cardstock, which I recognized almost immediately as the thick, familiar border of a Polaroid photograph. I picked it up slowly, holding it with both hands, and as I turned it over and brought the image into view, the stillness around me seemed to sharpen in that quiet, subtle way your body reacts to something before your mind fully catches up. It was a picture of our own campsite. There was no mistaking it. The angle of the tent, the placement of our 2 folding chairs beside the fire ring, the camp stove on the aluminum table. It had been taken from a distance, but not a great one, likely from just inside the tree line, near where the ridge began. One of us was visible in the shot, seated with their back turned, frozen mid-gesture as though unaware of being observed. And the clarity of the image left no doubt that the person behind the camera had been close. There were no other items inside the tent. No backpack, no boots, no evidence of someone arriving or planning to stay. It didn't feel like someone had just left and would be coming back soon. It felt like no one had ever been there at all. At least, not in the way we were used to thinking of someone. The placement of the sleeping bag and that single photograph gave the impression not of carelessness, but of intent. Someone had gone out of their way to leave just enough, no more and no less, as if the silence that surrounded it was part of the message. I didn't say anything out loud, and neither did she, because in that moment, there was nothing to be gained from naming what we were already thinking. We didn't panic. There was no sudden rush of movement or frantic packing. But there was an unmistakable shift in how we carried ourselves after that. Each of us moving with a calm but absolute purpose, exchanging only the barest of words as we began breaking down camp. It wasn't a decision so much as a shared understanding that lingered in the air between us. That whatever had happened down in that basin, whatever the meaning of that photograph or the appearance of that tent, this was no longer a place we felt safe being. We packed everything with care, double-checked nothing had been left behind, and began hiking out the same way we came, retracing our steps through the thick brush in silence that was broken only by the sound of our own movement and the distant groan of trees swaying under the weight of the late summer wind. We brought the Polaroid with us. Once we reached town later that evening, we made a report to the nearest ranger station. We handed over the photograph and described everything in detail. Where we had set up, when we had arrived, what we saw, and how certain we were that the red tent had not been present when we first arrived at the site. The ranger on duty listened carefully, took notes without interrupting, and didn't laugh or brush it off the way part of me had quietly expected. He said he'd log the report and send someone out to check the location within the next few days. We didn't hear anything for a while, but eventually, maybe 4 or 5 days later, we got a follow-up call. A ranger had hiked out to the site and looked around the area. They hadn't found anything, not a trace of a tent, not a scrap of fabric or discarded gear, not even disturbed earth where stakes might have been driven into the ground. No footprints, no signs of recent use. The sleeping bag, the Polaroid, the red tent, everything we had seen was gone. The clearing, he told us, looked untouched, as if no one had been there at all. There was nothing more they could do after that. It wasn't a crime scene, and there was no evidence to follow up on. As far as their records showed, the place was just another patch of state forest. And that's where it ended. The basin was empty, just open ground, just trees and moss and silence, just like it had been, until it wasn't. It was sometime in the final weeks of 2018, during that quiet, bleak stretch of late autumn when the forest loses its color and the air carries the brittle sharpness of oncoming winter, that the 4 of us, myself, Jared, Marcus, and Dean, set off for a cold weather camping trip deep in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. choosing a location so remote that it required hours of hiking just to reach the nearest point of trail that could be called even moderately traveled, far removed from towns, phone signals, or any signs of human life beyond what we carried on our backs. The area we selected, nestled in a ring of dense pines near a shallow, frozen lake, was one we had used once before, several years earlier during the spring thaw, and we remembered it for its isolation, its clean air, and the almost sacred silence that settled over the woods once the sun dipped low and the shadows stretched between the trees like fingers pressing against the ground. So we thought of it as the ideal place to spend a few days away from the distractions of the world, surrounded by nothing but wilderness, firelight, and the quiet rhythm of our own routines. We arrived by mid-afternoon, our boots crunching through the frozen underbrush, each of us layered against the cutting cold in thermal gear and windproof jackets, with our breath visible in pale plumes that floated upward and vanished quickly into the skeletal canopy above. And as we set about pitching our tents and gathering what dry wood we could find beneath the snow-dusted pines, there was a mood of calm, even a kind of lightness among us, as though the chill had stripped away whatever anxieties we had carried in from the cities, and left only our shared focus on building warmth, shelter, and the small comforts that make camping bearable in sub-zero conditions. The first night passed without anything unusual, though the temperature dropped well below what we had expected, forcing all of us to retreat into our sleeping bags earlier than planned. Our conversation dwindling from light-hearted jokes to low mutterings about the cold, and the way it pressed in through the seams of the tents like an unseen force trying to settle into our bones. And eventually, as the fire outside burned down to embers and the wind howled softly through the treetops, I drifted into a shallow, restless sleep, wrapped tightly in my bag and listening to the low, rustling sounds of my companions shifting in their sleep. It must have been sometime in the early hours before dawn, that strange in-between hour when the woods are at their quietest and the darkness feels somehow heavier, that I awoke, not from any sound or movement I could immediately identify, but from an intense, involuntary awareness that something was wrong. A deep, unexplainable alertness that seized me before I could even open my eyes. Like my body had registered a presence long before my thoughts could catch up. I remained still for several minutes, my breath shallow and visible in the cold air, staring at the roof of the tent while trying to calm the strange sensation pressing against my chest. And after confirming that Jared was still asleep beside me, his breathing slow and unbroken, I finally turned my head toward the mesh window, expecting only to see the dull orange glow of dying firelight, or perhaps the faint outlines of trees swaying in the wind. But instead, my eyes landed on something I did not, and could not, have anticipated, standing just beyond the reach of the extinguished fire, where the last embers still emitted a weak, pulsing glow against the frost-covered clearing, was a figure, tall, motionless, and unmistakably human in shape, facing directly toward our tent, positioned as if it had been standing there for some time, perhaps longer than I had been awake. And although the dim light distorted any details, it was clear that this person, or presence, had no flashlight, no backpack, no visible gear, and, most disturbingly, made no movement whatsoever, not even the subtle rocking of someone shifting their weight or the vapor of a breath escaping into the frigid air. At first, struggling against the dissonance of what I was seeing, I tried to convince myself that it had to be one of us, that perhaps Jared had gotten up without me noticing, and was standing out there for some reason. But this illusion unraveled almost immediately when I looked back and saw him still wrapped in his sleeping bag, unmoving. And when I reached out and nudged him softly, his groggy muttering and disoriented shifting confirmed beyond any doubt that he hadn't left the tent, hadn't moved at all, and certainly couldn't be the figure still standing just outside in the cold. When I turned back toward the window, preparing myself to continue watching, perhaps to try and see if the figure would move or reveal something about itself, it was no longer there. And though I strained my eyes in every direction, squinting through the frost-edged mesh for any sign of motion or shape, I could find nothing. Not even the faintest hint of retreating footsteps or shadows slipping through the trees, as though the figure had simply ceased to exist the moment I looked away. I lay frozen in my bag for the rest of the night, my ears straining for the sound of movement outside, my eyes darting back toward the window every few seconds, half expecting the shape to reappear, though the clearing remained empty and the tent remained still. And although my body was exhausted, there was no chance of sleep returning to me with the memory of that unmoving figure burned so clearly into my mind. When morning finally came, the light that filtered down through the branches was pale and washed out. The kind of light that doesn't bring warmth with it, but simply makes the cold more visible. We stepped out of our tent slowly, each of us stiff and sore, our movements sluggish from the kind of half-sleep that never quite reaches rest. No one said much at first. We were still shaking off the night, each of us focused on small tasks, zipping coats, stoking the fire, rechecking our gear, as if pretending that it had just been another normal night out in the woods. It wasn't until Marcus pointed something out near the edge of the fire pit that the quiet broke. At first glance, it looked like a smudge in the frost, just a soft mark in the thin ice on the forest floor, but once we stepped closer, it was clear it was a footprint. Bare, human, and perfectly shaped. Toes and heel and everything, standing out in sharp contrast against the white ground. There shouldn't have been any footprints like that. Not out here, not without shoes, and certainly not in temperatures that would turn exposed skin numb within minutes. We began to see more of them. A trail. Not just one or two, but dozens. Some were faint, already softening in the morning thaw, while others looked recent, freshly pressed into the ground, as if whatever made them had been walking only an hour or two earlier. They weren't laid out in any sort of direct path. Instead, they curved and circled around the tents, looped behind trees, passed right through the clearing, even paused beside the fire. It didn't look like someone passing through. It looked like someone pacing. We followed the trail as far as it went, moving slowly, each of us focused on the ground, none of us speaking. The prince wandered off into the woods, crossed a shallow dip in the terrain, then came to a sudden and confusing stop near a crooked pine tree. There were no branches broken overhead, no rocks disturbed nearby, no sign of anyone having turned around or changed direction. The trail just ended, as if whoever had made those prints had taken one final step and then disappeared into thin air. After standing there in silence for a long moment, we headed back to camp without saying anything. There wasn't a group decision, no dramatic exchange, just the quiet understanding that we weren't going to stay another night. We broke down the tents, packed up faster than usual, and by mid-morning we were on our way out, hiking in silence except for the crunch of our boots and the wind weaving through the branches above. The woods felt different on the way back, emptier, heavier somehow, like something had shifted, even though everything still looked the same. I didn't talk about what I saw for a long time, not because I was afraid of being laughed at or because I thought people wouldn't believe me, but because I didn't have the language for it. I couldn't describe what it felt like to wake up in the middle of the night and see someone standing there, completely still, facing our tent, not moving or speaking or showing any sign of being alive in the way we understand it. And I couldn't explain how deeply wrong it felt, how unnatural it was, not just because of where we were or how cold it was, but because whoever that was didn't seem to be acting like a person at all. Even now, years later, I don't have a good explanation for any of it. I've thought about it more times than I can count, especially during the winter, when I see frost on the ground or catch sight of footprints in the snow. I still hike, still camp sometimes, but I stay on marked trails now, close to other people. And I don't go too deep into the woods anymore, not when it's cold, and never near frozen lakes. I just don't feel the same about the silence out there. Not after that night. Because whether I dreamed it or not, whether it was a person or something else entirely, I know what I saw. I know how still they stood. I know how close they got. And no matter how many times I try to convince myself that it was just a strange encounter with some lost hiker or hermit or wanderer, I always come back to that single, undeniable fact. No one should have been out there barefoot, in that cold, moving silently through frost and pine needles like they were made of air. Some things don't leave a mark on the world when they pass through, but they stay with you.